When Karen arrived with surveyors and a construction team ready to carve up my land, she was convinced she had finally won. She called it community improvement, but I knew the truth. This was nothing more than an attempt to push me out, to erase my family's legacy with cold paperwork and HOA regulations. She stood there barking orders, clipboard in hand, watching as her team marked up the ground, preparing to fence off what was legally mine. But Karen had no idea that her reckless power play would backfire spectacularly. She thought she'd force me off my own property. She had no idea she was giving me the perfect excuse to fight back. Because if she wanted to turn my land into her playground, I'd make sure she regretted every second of it. She declared war. So I built a gun range right on their doorstep. I never thought I'd find myself in an all-out war with an HOA. But when that cream-colored letter arrived in my mailbox, stamped with the Lakeside Estates HOA logo, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't about community standards. This was personal. I unfolded it slowly, scanning the fine print as my blood pressure steadily climbed. Violation. Grass exceeding permissible height. Fine. $10,000. I laughed. A short, humorless sound. 10 grand. For what? Grass that was maybe 2 inches taller than their arbitrary rule allowed? It wasn't the first violation. Not even close. It had started small, a notice about my truck being an eyesore. Then a warning about my American flag, which they claimed was displayed improperly. It wasn't. Then came the complaints about my military memorabilia, items that had sat on my porch for years, suddenly deemed disturbing to the neighborhood aesthetic. Each notice came with increasingly absurd fines. And now, this. A final push to force me out. I crumpled the paper and tossed it onto a growing pile, months' worth of similar HOA letters, each one more outrageous than the last. Something wasn't right. I had lived here for 5 years, barely interacting with the HOA. Suddenly, I was public enemy number 1. The land wasn't just any plot of dirt. It was my grandfather's legacy, land he had purchased decades ago, long before Lakeside Estates sprawled across the landscape. A fact Karen, the HOA president, clearly didn't care about. That evening, I sat alone at my kitchen table, beer in hand, flipping through old property records. A knock at the door jolted me from my thoughts. Michael Chen, my neighbor, a math teacher, quiet, reserved, stood outside, glancing over his shoulder like he didn't want anyone to see him there. "Mason," he said, voice low. "Got a minute?" I gestured him in, offered him a beer. He declined, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Then, after a long pause, he dropped the bombshell. "At the last HOA meeting," he said, eyes serious, "Karen was talking about your property." I leaned in. She said, and I'm quoting, "We need to make living here so expensive for Caldwell that he has no choice but to sell." Silence stretched between us. I was building a gun range, right on their doorstep. That night I made 3 calls. The first was to Elena, my lawyer, to confirm the legality of what I was planning. The second was to my old Army buddy Ryan, who ran a shooting range in Austin, to discuss logistics. The third was to the county clerk's office, leaving a message about filing for a business permit first thing in the morning. If Karen thought she could drive me out with fines for tall grass, let's see how she felt about the sound of gunfire at 8 a.m. every Sunday morning, precisely when she hosted her famous champagne brunches by the pool. The business permit application process was surprisingly straightforward. Caldwell Tactical Range, I wrote on the form, detailing plans for a moderately sized outdoor shooting facility focused on responsible gun ownership, veteran support, and community education. Because the land was outside city limits and zoned agricultural, restrictions were minimal. I included detailed safety protocols, noise mitigation strategies, though not enough to completely eliminate the sound, and environmental protection measures. When the clerk raised an eyebrow at the location, I simply smiled and said, "Family land, been in our name for generations." While waiting for the permit approval, I didn't stay idle. I reached out to local veterans groups, offering free memberships and specialized programs. I contacted gun owners clubs, pitching the range as a safe, properly managed alternative to the makeshift shooting spots in the desert. and I started clearing the land, marking out firing lanes, planning infrastructure, all perfectly legal activities that, coincidentally, involved a fair amount of noise during daylight hours. Especially when Ryan brought over heavy equipment to help with the earth moving. It took exactly 3 days for Karen to notice. I was measuring out the main firing line when her Mercedes came screeching to a halt at the edge of my property. She stormed out like a hurricane in designer clothes, her face flushed with anger. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, teetering across the uneven ground in her impractical heels. I straightened up, wiped my hands on my jeans, and answered calmly. "Developing my property, Mrs. Harrington. Well outside HOA jurisdiction, I might add." Her eyes narrowed, taking in the partially cleared land, the stakes marking out what would soon become shooting lanes. "You can't put a shooting range here," she sputtered. "It's completely legal," I finished for her. "I've already filed all the necessary paperwork. Would you like to see the copies?" The next evening, an emergency HOA meeting was called. The room was packed. Word had spread quickly, and residents were curious. Some concerned, others amused at Karen's very public meltdown. She stood at the front, voice raised. "This facility will create unacceptable noise levels and pose a safety risk near our family homes," she declared. I let her finish her speech, then stood up. "If I may," I said. "First, the range will exceed all safety requirements. Second, it will operate only during reasonable hours. And third, it's worth noting that the property in question is not within HOA jurisdiction. I'm attending this meeting as a courtesy to my neighbors." A heated discussion followed. Some residents voiced concerns, while others, particularly those who had also faced HOA pressure, were supportive. The next day, Richard Harrington showed up at my door. Unlike Karen, he was composed, professional, and straight to the point. "Let's discuss this like businessmen," he said, settling into my living room with the ease of someone accustomed to getting his way. "I understand you're upset about the HOA notices. Perhaps we've been overzealous." He paused, studying me carefully. "I'm prepared to make those fines disappear." Then carefully, he added, "I'll offer you twice the market value for your property. Cash deal, quick closing, no complications." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "You could buy a much nicer place," he gestured vaguely, "without all this conflict." I let the silence stretch between us, watching him try to hide his impatience. Finally, I leaned forward. "Mr. Harrington, this land isn't just property to me. It's my grandfather's legacy. He taught me to stand up for what's mine, and that's exactly what I'm doing." Richard's smile tightened. "Be reasonable, Caldwell. You can't win against us. I have connections throughout the county." The thinly veiled threat hung in the air. I didn't flinch. "And I have the law on my side," I replied evenly, "plus a growing list of your neighbors who are tired of being bullied by your wife and her rules." Richard's expression darkened. "You'll regret this decision." I stood, motioning toward the door. "By the way," I said, grinning slightly, "you're all invited to our grand opening. I'll be sure to send Karen a special invitation." I had just declared war on two of the most powerful people in the county. But as my grandfather used to say, sometimes you have to stand your ground, especially when the odds seem stacked against you. The next morning, I sent Elena the security footage. "This is our smoking gun," I told her. Karen's words, her open threats, her confession about her family's grip on the county were all captured in crystal-clear audio and video. Elena wasted no time. She forwarded the footage to Sarah Chen, the journalist who had been digging into the Harringtons. Within 24 hours, the video was published alongside a full expose, documenting the manipulated environmental reports, the fraudulent land deals, and the harassment tactics used against homeowners. The article exploded online. State investigators began looking into Harrington estates, and suddenly, official complaints about zoning fraud, tax evasion, and HOA mismanagement flooded in from residents who had finally had enough. Karen tried everything to suppress the story, legal threats, media pressure, even calling in political favors. But the dam had broken. The county commissioner called an emergency meeting, announcing that all Harrington Estates projects were under review and Karen would be removed from the Education Foundation Board immediately. That evening, Richard showed up at my property. He didn't smile this time. "You're done," he said, voice low. "This county will turn against you. I'll make sure of it." I didn't blink. "Funny. That's exactly what they just said about you." He stiffened, knowing he had lost control. "Take the offer," he snapped. "Take the money and get out before this gets worse for you." I crossed my arms. "I'm not going anywhere." He opened his mouth, then stopped himself. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his car. The formal HOA meeting the following week was packed. Karen sat at the head of the table, expression tight as a petition for her removal circulated through the room. Michael was one of the first to sign it. Neighbors, even her former allies, followed suit. The board voted unanimously. Karen was removed as HOA president. But the final nail in the coffin came when investigators announced official fraud charges against Harrington Estates. Karen and Richard vanished from public view, selling off assets and moving out of town quietly, their names permanently stained by scandal. I stood on my porch weeks later, watching the final touches being placed on Caldwell Tactical Range. The grand opening was a huge success. Veterans, neighbors, even local police turned up to celebrate. I had won, not just against Karen and Richard, but against the system that had tried to crush me. And there was no sweeter victory than knowing that she had built her empire on stolen foundations, and I had torn it down, brick by brick. That evening, as I reviewed the footage of Karen's meltdown, my phone rang. It was Richard Harrington, his voice subdued and businesslike. "We need to talk privately, not at your place, not at mine. The diner on Highway 16 tomorrow, 7 a.m. He hung up before I could respond. I immediately called Elena and Sheriff Thompson, letting them both know about the meeting. "It could be a trap, or it could be a genuine overture," Elena mused. "Either way, you shouldn't go alone." Thompson agreed, arranging for a deputy to be at the diner at the same time, while Elena would take a nearby booth. The diner was nearly empty when I arrived the next morning. Richard sat in a back booth, nursing a cup of coffee, looking like he hadn't slept well. I slid into the seat across from him, and he glanced around cautiously before speaking. "Karen doesn't know I'm here," he began without preamble. "And she can't find out." He looked older than his 56 years in the harsh fluorescent lighting, the weight of the last few weeks evident in the lines of his face. He exhaled, then pushed a folder across the table toward me. Inside were documents, signed HOA forms, zoning applications, and internal memos. But something stood out immediately. The signatures. Some were shaky, mismatched, clearly forged. "She's been falsifying HOA paperwork for years," Richard admitted, "including my own." I kept my expression neutral, waiting for him to continue. "This resort project, it's become an obsession for her," he said, voice dropping lower. "But there's something you should know. The real reason she wants your land specifically." He leaned forward. "There's a pristine aquifer beneath your property." Everything clicked into place. Karen's aggression, the falsified environmental reports, her increasing desperation. It wasn't just about a luxury resort. It was about controlling a critical water source in a drought-stricken region. "Water rights in this county are gold, Mason," Richard continued. "The resort is just the public face. The real value is locking down that aquifer for future development." I studied him carefully. "And why are you telling me this?" I asked. Richard sighed heavily. "Self-preservation, mostly. I built my business over 30 years. Karen's recklessness is going to bring everything down. I'd rather cut a deal now than face what's coming." His proposal was simple. He would provide evidence of Karen's illegal activities and testify if necessary, in exchange for immunity from prosecution and a structured settlement that would allow him to salvage part of his business. "She's been moving assets into her personal accounts for months," Richard added. "I need to protect what I can." As I left the diner, Elena met me in the parking lot. "Well?" she asked, eyes sharp with concern. I handed her the folder Richard had given me. "We've got them," I said simply. "But this just got a lot bigger than an HOA dispute." With Richard's evidence in hand, Elena laid out the next steps. "This isn't just about winning your battle," she explained as we sorted through the documents in her office. "This is systematic corruption affecting the entire community. We need to build an airtight case." Over the next few days, we worked tirelessly, corroborating Richard's claims with our own research and testimony from other affected residents. The full picture emerged, a tangled web of fraud, manipulation, and intimidation that had stretched across Lakeside Estates for years. Karen had used the HOA as her personal enforcement arm, selectively targeting properties she wanted for development while turning a blind eye to violations from her allies. She had manipulated bylaws, forged signatures, and weaponized HOA regulations to push out those who stood in her way. And behind it all, the aquifer, a resource so valuable that she had been willing to destroy livelihoods, fabricate environmental reports, and intimidate residents to get it. While Elena built the legal case, I focused on the community. The HOA nightmare stories grew into something bigger, a forum for homeowners to openly discuss water rights, development impact, and HOA abuses. Michael Chen became an unexpected leader, organizing town meetings outside of HOA control, where residents could speak freely without fear of retaliation. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was a community uprising against unchecked power. Karen, increasingly desperate, escalated her attacks. The local newspaper ran hit pieces about how my dangerous gun range threatened the neighborhood. Signs appeared in yards, opposing the facility. And then, the intimidation turned personal. Michael found his tires slashed in the school parking lot. No security cameras had caught the incident. Sheriff Thompson increased patrols but warned me. When people like Karen start losing control, they become unpredictable. Be careful. Elena suggested we go public, on a grand scale. Not an HOA meeting, she clarified. A town hall. Open to the press, open to county officials. Make it too public for them to interfere. The auditorium was packed beyond capacity, standing room only. Karen sat in the front row, defiant. Richard looked resigned. I kept my speech short. "This isn't about me anymore," I told the crowd. "It's about who controls the future of our community. A select few acting in secret, or all of us working together transparently." Then, Elena took the stage. Slide by slide, document by document, she laid out the truth. Karen's forged paperwork, the aquifer cover-up, the manipulated HOA regulations, the illegal zoning changes, the falsified environmental reports. The crowd sat in stunned silence as the full scope of deception was revealed. Then I played the security footage, Karen threatening me on my porch, her voice laced with rage and entitlement. The moment it flashed across the screen, everything changed. The woman who had styled herself as the guardian of community values was now exposed as nothing more than a bully and a fraud. Even her former supporters looked horrified. Michael stood up and calmly detailed how she had threatened his job over his support for me. And Karen finally snapped. "Of course I did," she shouted. "People like you and Caldwell are destroying everything we built. Do you think quality communities maintain themselves? Someone has to enforce standards. Someone has to protect property values from people who don't belong." The auditorium fell silent. I leaned into the microphone. "And what kind of people would those be exactly?" Karen locked eyes with me, realization dawning. She had said too much. The crowd murmured in anger, voices rising into outrage. "You mean veterans?" I continued. "Teachers? Working families who lived here before you decided it wasn't exclusive enough?" Karen looked around the room, stunned, suddenly cast as the villain in her own story. And Richard, expression grim, simply murmured, "You just ruined everything." Karen turned on him instantly. "Don't touch me. You've already betrayed me." Her voice shook with fury, but the damage was irreversible. Then, finally, came the moment that finished her completely. Elena stepped forward. "Mrs. Harrington," she said, voice sharp, "are you confirming that you deliberately manipulated HOA regulations to force Mr. Caldwell from his property to gain access to the aquifer beneath it? And in that instant, Karen realized the legal implications of what she had just admitted. She had buried herself. This is the ultimate downfall. Karen went from ruling lakeside estates with an iron fist to facing criminal charges, financial ruin, and public disgrace. Her desperation led to an actual crime, thinking she could burn it all down and walk away unscathed. But instead, she sealed her own fate. The trial was the final nail in the coffin. Watching her sit in that courtroom, stripped of her authority, forced to answer for every lie, every manipulation, every crime, was a moment of pure victory. And Richard turning on her? Poetic justice at its finest. The irony? She wanted me out, wanted my land for her own corrupt plans. But instead of taking it, she was forced to pay into a fund that helps veterans secure housing, the very people she tried to push aside. Standing at the entrance of Caldwell Tactical Range, looking out over my grandfather's land, I knew that this wasn't just about winning against one corrupt person. It was a stand against unchecked power, against bullies who thought they could rewrite the rules for their own gain. Karen had thought she could break me, drown me in fines, destroy my home. Instead, she erased herself.